The threats just keep piling up in this game by Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa. His opponent is Eric Hansen. This is the Oslo Esports Cup. It's a rapid time control, 15 minutes for each side, a 10-second increment, and as the game progresses, these threats increase until something has to break. Let's jump right in. Praggnanandhaa has white. Eric Hansen has black. Pragg plays d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5. Eric Hansen plays the Grunfeld defense, allowing white to set up a big center and then attacking it. Pawn takes, knight takes, e4, knight c3, bc3, and we have our nice center and the bishop at g7. So the traditional ideas are black attacks with the dark squared bishop, plays c5, knight c6, etc. Praggnanandhaa plays queen to a4 check. We've seen this move from him before. He likes this move. The most commonly played move and the best scoring move for black is knight to d7, which we've seen. Eric Hansen plays c6, and white has a decent score after this move. I find this to be a bit peculiar. Black wants to play c5 usually in this line, so this seems like sort of a delay of the main strategy. Knight to f3, castles, bishop e2, b5. And this move has been played 13 times in my database, but again, it doesn't score that well. It feels like black is losing the thread of attacking the center. He's like he's trying to play around this big center instead of attacking it directly. Queen to a3. We've seen, again, Pragg likes this square for his queen in a Grunfeld defense, controlling the dark squares and hitting e7. Knight to d7. So he's decided, Eric Hansen decided not to hit with c5, but he wants to hit with e5. So the knight and the bishop are in place to support that push. Pragg, seeing this, plays bishop to g5, or castles first, rook e8, and then bishop to g5, pinning the pawn at e7 so it can't advance yet. And now Eric Hansen decides to move the knight to b6. It's almost as if he's decided to switch strategies from playing e5 to trying to control the light squares on this e6, a2 diagonal, almost like he's had a change of heart in what he wants to do. Rook a to d1, centralizing. Queen to d6, steps out of the pin and offers a trade of queens. The side with less space would like to trade pieces, and Pragg wants no part of that. He plays the queen to c1 and keeps the queen in contact with the bishop at g5. Bishop to e6, attacking e2, playing to control those light squares. Bishop to f4 counterattacks the queen. The queen moves back to d8, and now knight to e5. Hits the c6 pawn, and computers in this position recommend bishop takes e5. That's crazy. I can't imagine any human being voluntarily giving up that beautiful bishop in this position. And Eric Hansen does not do that. He plays the queen to c8 to defend the c6 pawn. Queen to c2 defends the a2 pawn, which of course was attacked by the bishop at e6. f6 kicks the knight away, but does weaken some squares. Knight to d3, aiming at c5. Bishop to f7. And that clears the way for the e5 pawn to advance. So finally, he's ready to attack the center. So how does Praggnanandhaa deal with this? Well, he beats him to the punch. He plays e5 first. Now Eric Hansen plays knight to a4, which I find to be a kind of a peculiar move. It does put some pressure on c3, but I would think that the knight would want to enter in on these weak light squares instead. Rook f to e1, a5 advancing on the queen side, bishop to g3, queen to e6, attacking the a2 pawn a second time, the bishop and queen together, rook to d2, defending it a second time, and now g5, and this is a really ugly looking move, weakening the squares around his king. I think he wants to keep this knight at d3 out of f4, where it would hit the queen at e6. The computer's come up with an interesting idea here. It actually recommends queen takes pawn, just giving up a piece. Queen takes, bishop takes, rook takes, knight takes c3. And black would have two pawns for the piece, but the pawns are actually quite healthy. And the computer thinks this is an equal position. But again, human beings really would have a hard time giving up the material like that in a game like this. So g5 was played, bishop f1, clearing the way for the rook, which has some x-ray pressure against the queen as soon as the pawn at e5 moves away, so the queen gets out of the way. h4, Pragg continues to attack this fragile structure on the king's side, and the best move from Eric Hansen would have been to just take the pawn, even though it creates weaknesses. The move he plays, h6, is even worse because it creates all of these light squared weaknesses around black's king. Pawn takes pawn, hg5, and now queen to c1. He wants to avoid the pin from the bishop that's going to be coming to g6, almost definitely. And he could have played f4 immediately, too. That would have been fine, trying to open up lines. So he plays queen to c1, bishop g6, and now f4. Same idea, different move order. Bishop to h6, pawn takes, pawn takes. If he takes with the bishop, it looks like he's skewering the rook and queen, but white can just play bishop to f4. It's defended by the knight on d3, and the threat is alleviated. So he takes with the pawn, e6. What Pragg is doing, he's clearing out this e5 square. So now the bishop, the knight, or the rook could land on that square and cause all kinds of trouble for black. Rook to f8, going to the open file. Knight to e5, hits the bishop at g6. The bishop moves to f5, and now knight to f7. Protected by the pawn at e6, he hits the bishop at g7. Now Eric Hansen makes the correct decision. He decides to give up the exchange in this position. What if he tries to preserve the bishop instead and not lose any material? Then this shot, this bolt from the blue, c4, and the queen is trapped, has nowhere to go. After pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, you can look at every single square. There's nowhere for the queen to go, and black is lost. So Eric Hansen just takes the knight, and then c4 is played as an intermezzo. Here, if he takes the pawn, then bishop takes, pushes the queen to d8, ef7 check, and the pawn at f7 is protected, and that's the game would be completely over. If queen to d8 immediately, pawn takes, king takes, rook to f2, pins the bishop at f5, e6 to defend it. Now queen to e3, threatening to capture on e6 because the bishop at f5 is pinned. Queen to d7 to defend that pawn. Pawn takes b5, pawn takes b5. Now bishop takes with a double attack on the knight and the queen. And if the queen takes the bishop, then queen to e6 check. Again, the queen cannot be captured, and this would lead to a forced mate. So Eric Hansen decides to just go ahead and play queen takes e6. After rook takes queen, bishop takes rook. And believe it or not, material is still equal here. White has black's queen, but black has a knight, a rook, and a pawn in exchange for the queen. The problem is the king safety, the coordination of the pieces for black are just a mess here. Pawn takes, or it doesn't recapture with a pawn. He plays g4, excuse me. And it looks like he has that skewer, finally, after all. But after this move, queen takes c6, Pragg counterattacks the rook at a8, so he doesn't lose any material. Bishop to e3, check. Bishop to f2, and in this position, Eric Hansen resigned. Let's look and see why. If bishop to f2 check, just rook f2, and he's just left with a double attack on the rook and the bishop. He can take the rook at f2. It doesn't change anything. He just loses material. If instead bishop takes rook, then queen a8 check, king g7, queen to e4 attacks the bishop at e6, and after bishop f5, queen to e5 check, king to g6, bishop to c4, attacks the rook, and if he wants to keep the pawn at e7 defended, after rook h7, bishop to e6, and the light squares are gone, and the game is over. His king cannot survive. So a really well-played game by Pragg. We see black not attacking the center maybe as ferociously as he should, and Pragg has those threats. They add up, and boom, the position collapses. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.